Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. This panel is joining you from the West Coast, where the sun is just rising on our forests that we like to boast store more carbon than any other terrestrial ecosystem. And we are so thrilled to join this very exciting conference. The participants on this panel have all been committed to natural climate solutions for a decade or more, feeling often like we are climbing a steep and very muddy hill, and are so happy to finally have the wind mostly at our backs, with finally the recognition of the importance of forests and other natural landscapes. The timing, of course, could not be more critical. This is what we know. This is an existential crisis. We need a transition to a bioeconomy as fast and effectively as possible, with a clear focus on equity, among other reasons, because like it or not, we are all going to swim or sink together. We need all sectors, all countries, all companies, all individuals, and all strategies to play their part in this global transition. And we know that within this transition are the seeds of a better, more equitable, and richer life experience for humans and all the living things with which we share this precious planet. Within that set of actions, natural climate solutions are a critical part, especially in the first decade of solutions. They are available, low cost, proven, and laden with co-benefits, including enhancing biodiversity, protecting precious water sources, and supporting rural and indigenous livelihoods. This panel will explore natural climate solutions from three perspectives: a corporation that is made and is executing a commitment to reduce emissions and invest in natural climate solutions, a forest land investment firm that is successfully developing forest carbon projects within a working forest and investment context, and a nonprofit that is expanding public funding for natural climate solutions. We will start with a corporate perspective, that of Netflix, which has made a comprehensive science-based commitment to addressing climate change, along with the biodiversity crisis. Alexia Kelly, Netflix's director of Net Zero Plus Nature, will describe the company's commitment to net zero, reached not in 2030 or 2050, but by the end of 2022, through an initiative that includes reducing the company's emissions and investing in natural climate solutions for emissions that can't be avoided. I first met Alexia when she was policy director and superstar at Climate Trust in 2006, and have been following her career and her with interest ever since. After Climate Trust, Alexia worked for the US State Department as a senior climate change advisor, and also held various positions with foundations and climate solution implementers before joining Netflix in May of this year. So she has the benefit of having explored climate solutions from the perspective of a policymaker, funder, implementer, and advisor. Next, we will hear from Amrita Vatsal, Managing Director of EFM and responsible for EFM's business development and carbon initiatives. Amrita was first lured to forests by the horror of the annual smoke for the intentional burning of forests drifting across her desk at PricewaterhouseCoopers in Singapore. Following the fires led her to Kalimantan and beyond, where she became intrigued by natural climate solutions as a way to address deforestation and climate change, and then on to the University of Michigan for a joint MBA and MS. I then had the great fortune of meeting Amrita when she graduated in 2011, and we have been partners at EFM ever since. Amrita will describe EFM's approach to managing forests for the whole suite of services and products that they produce, from timber to other bioproducts, to carbon, to habitat, to recreation, to community livelihoods, and how EFM manages for the whole and monetizes the different components within an investment context. From a carbon perspective, EFM has worked with both corporations like Netflix in developing voluntary carbon projects on our forests, and the public sector, and with entities like TPL, incorporating the increasing flow of federal and state funding to protect forests and their carbon stores. So speaking of public funding, Richard Korff, the Washington State Director for the Trust for Public Land, has been instrumental in directing public funding to protecting forests. He joined TPL after working for state and city agencies in Washington, doing conservation real estate, and also spending some time in the private sector as a real estate broker. During his time at TPL, Richard has directed $60 million in funding into conservation transactions to protect forest land from conversion, including working with EFM on projects. TPL's nationwide initiatives include securing $10 billion of public funding for land protection. Richard will describe the surge of an instrument called an Enhanced Easement. I should also introduce myself, Bettina von Hagen, co-founder and CEO of EFM, which my partner Amrita will describe in more detail. I came to this work 30 years ago, compelled by the species extinction crisis, which drove me to co-found EFM in 2004. Amidst all of the carbon focus, I confess, it is still species extinction that completely slays me. However, with natural climate solutions, you don't have to choose. It doesn't matter what brings you. Concerns over climate, water, biodiversity, cultural diversity, rural livelihoods, love of wild places, you end up in the same place. Protect what's left, restore what's degraded, and improve impact outcomes on managed forests. In terms of the panel format, we have an hour. We will start with introductory remarks from each of our panelists and then go to a conversation, which includes your questions. So feel free to start sending questions at any time for all of us or for an individual panelist, and we will incorporate them into our conversation. And with that, let's turn to our first panelist, Alexia Kelly.
Good morning, Bettina. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you here today. It's a pleasure to join this conference and to speak to folks who we don't have an opportunity to speak with very often. So looking forward to the discussion. And Bettina and I have a mutual fan club. She's been a longtime mentor of mine for many years. So delighted to be here and have, as always, incredibly impressed with the work that they're doing. So as Bettina mentioned, Netflix is relatively new to the sustainability game. We are somewhat late to the party. There was not a sustainability office at Netflix even just a year ago. So we joke that we're trying to make up for our tardiness in joining the movement with speed, ambition, and breadth of commitment. So in that vein, Netflix announced in March of this year that we would be net zero by 2022 across all three scopes of our emissions. And has committed to a science-based target of 45% reduction across scopes 1 and 2 emissions below 2019 levels by 2030. So I think coming out of Glasgow this week, the importance of balancing both long-term decarbonization, mid-century net zero goals, and the urgent need to act comprehensively and with great intention in this decade, particularly as it pertains to nature-based solutions, has really come to the fore. And Netflix is working to really embody that, what we call our yes and approach. Yes, we need all to be working urgently to reduce our internal emissions across the fossil-based combustion that we know is just a core part of being a business, doing business in the world that we live in today, while also really recognizing the importance and urgency of channeling investment into the places and the resources that we know are available to us to help us balance global emissions. So as we work towards reducing our internal emissions, we are also voluntarily going above the line to fully compensate for all three scopes, which we've drawn, for those of you who are involved in corporate sustainability accounting, a fairly wide boundary around. So our productions and other sources of emissions in our scope 3 footprint. So we're fully neutralizing those by investing in projects that both prevent carbon from entering the atmosphere, what we call carbon conservation, as well as restoration and removal. So the combination of those two things we see as really core, particularly to robust and credible action in the next decade, but on an ongoing basis, because certainly there's no end of degradation and destruction that's happening in the natural world that we need to find incentives and pathways to help reverse. These nature-based solutions you're all very familiar with, but we invest in a portfolio of forests, grasslands, peatlands, mangroves, all of which provide important biodiversity benefits, water security benefits, as well as climate change mitigation benefits and livelihood benefits. So Netflix has developed a fairly comprehensive approach to assessing and vetting the various offset projects that are out there. We currently only purchase from what we call the big four, so Verra, American Carbon Registry, and two others that I'm forgetting at the moment, but they are smaller gold standard. And those standards, we think the systems that they have in place really offer a lot of important protections as we invest in these projects all over the world. So we have a fairly comprehensive portfolio of emission reduction projects that we invest in, and we undertake a rigorous vetting process for each of them. So in addition to ensuring that they're issued under a credible third-party registry, we also do direct project developer interviews and understand what the governance and community engagement benefit arrangements are for those projects. And we've seen a really wide spectrum of governance and benefit sharing arrangements in place across the global carbon markets. I think we're at a moment in time that is not unlike when I started my career in 2006 in this space, where there's a lot of excitement. We're starting to see a lot of froth again in the market. Prices are increasing very rapidly. We've seen prices go up on average 40% over the course of the last year. There were more carbon offsets transacted in 2021 than I think all of history. So the market is growing very rapidly. But that also means that there's a lot of uncertainty in the space, and we're seeing a lot of speculative actors coming back in the market as well. So from Netflix's perspective, we believe that these projects and carbon offset markets broadly can play an important role in helping drive investment into the places that we need it, which includes, of course, conservation and restoration of natural resources. But that if we're going to do that, it needs to be done well, it needs to be done rigorously, with great attention paid to the impacts on the local communities and various people who depend on these lands, both in North America as well as in emerging market contexts. So delighted to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to provide additional details if folks are interested, and I'll look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Alexia. That was a really great overview. And I'd like to now turn to Amrita. And Amrita, maybe you can address how you are incorporating those high quality, rigorous offset development standards into your work at EFM.
Great, I'd be happy to. And good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to our hosts for having this conversation, and for Bettina, and to Bettina for bringing us together here today. So I'm Amrita Vatsal with EFM. We've been investing in natural climate solutions since 2004. And we've been pioneering an approach to forestry that we call climate smart forestry within an institutional investment context here in the Western United States. Climate smart forestry to us means investing both in the mitigation and the adaptation potential of forests, so that we end up with forests that are increasing carbon storage, but also delivering very important co-benefits like clean drinking water, biodiversity, recreation, and very importantly, delivering local benefits to our communities. We do this by managing our forests holistically, so that instead of just optimizing for one dimension, that is timber extraction, we are optimizing across timber and non-timber revenues and values. We are doing this by leaving more forest on the landscape. We're diversifying revenue streams, and in the context of doing that, we're increasing sources of income and therefore diversifying risk. From an investor perspective, we believe we're creating a more valuable asset in the long term that will allow and create more options for the investor and leave a more valuable asset for communities and the public writ large. Our strategy involves monetizing, as I noted, timber. Of course, we're a 100% FSC certified manager. And to this approach, we also bring our expertise in conservation finance. So we are actively developing high quality additional carbon offset projects. We are monetizing various forms of easements that capture the non-timber values on our forests, including their important ecological, biodiversity, water quality, and recreational values. And we're also being very creative with respect to our capital stack, bringing in and integrating tax-motivated capital and foundation capital, mostly as bridge strategies, until our emerging ecosystem markets mature. And so in that context, I thought it would perhaps be the most helpful to provide an example of the work that we are doing. And one particular project that we completed recently comes to mind. It's a property that we acquired a couple of years ago called Fort Rock. It is 25,000 acres located just south of Bend, amongst an incredible landscape of recreational lands, which has a lot of significance for biodiversity, including mule deer. And this property has a legacy of land management that afflicts millions of acres in the West. you have a landscape that was primarily overharvested, where the largest trees were primarily taken out, leaving the future owner with not many options, but to harvest and slowly remove the remaining timber and drive rotation ages down. Facing these choices, instead of continuing this extractive model of forestry, EFM chose instead to develop a carbon project. And in this case, our partner was Nike, also headquartered in Oregon, so that we could monetize the growth and the sequestration of carbon that this property was capable of delivering. So we are allowing the recovery of this forest, its ecological potential, as well as creating future financial potential by allowing our trees to get bigger, older, and more valuable, and at the same time creating ecological value for important species, creating connectivity for mule deer, and supporting the recreational values of this landscape. And so we think that is ultimately climate smart forestry, and that is the kind of forestry EFM is practicing across 130,000 acres in the Western United States. And we certainly believe that as our ecosystem markets mature, as carbon becomes more valuable, that this is the only kind of forestry that we should see happening across our institutional portfolios. So I look forward to describing our approach further and to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Amrita. That was a great example of how carbon financing can be used to restore forests, especially when timber production is not an option. I want to turn next to Richard Korff, and I'm really excited about his presentation. There is a lot of public funding coming to conservation in the United States now in the new administration. And Richard has, I think, and TPL have a really good idea of sort of how to begin to channel that public funding into forest conservation, forest restoration in a context that public agencies can understand and implement immediately. So with that, over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Bettina. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the West Coast, at least virtually, West Coast of the U.S. anyway. My name is Richard Korff, and I am the Washington Director of Land Conservation for the Trust for Public Land, and I'm based in Seattle. The Trust for Public Land is an American nonprofit that's been doing conservation work across the U.S. for 50 years. This has ranged from moving lands from private to public ownership for the creation of parks and open space to placing easements on private land that allows for their continued use as farming and forestry, but preventing their conversion to concrete and asphalt. We refer to these easements as working land easements. TPL has done extensive work with easements on forest lands across the U.S., with my own experiences focused in the Pacific Northwest, one of the great timber growing areas of the world, and also home to trees that absorb vast amounts of carbon as they grow into majestic trees like Douglas firs and western hemlocks. Most of this work is currently supported by public sources, as Bettina was referencing there. Because of our work, including work with EFM, large tracts of land continue as working forests today and retain a substantial amount of their carbon. But this is not good enough with what we know today, and we understand that. Growing trees captures carbon, and timber products help keep that carbon sequestered. Currently, the standard practice of commercial timber on the west side of the Cascade Mountains in Washington and Oregon is to harvest trees on a 35 to 45 year rotation. This cycle is hard on ecosystem services, the ecosystem services these forests provide, but is optimal for commercial interest working to maximize value to their shareholders. We suspect that increasing the cut rotation to a 60 or 80 year cut cycle would vastly improve the ecosystem services provided by these forests. Things like clean water, healthy habitat, moisture retention, and carbon capture. TPL is currently working on a pilot project to create an enhanced easement, what we're referring to as enhanced easement, that would extend these cut rotations through the purchase of an easement from property owners. This easement would stipulate the change to a longer cut cycle. Part of our effort is to identify the real cost in foregoing the shorter cut cycle and to shift landowners' optimization models to a longer rotation. This cost is what would be the basis for the investment in the enhanced easement. We believe that working lands play and will continue to play a large role in helping us mitigate carbon. We also believe that using market mechanisms like real estate values can help to get people and organizations to want to participate in a broad way.
Great, thank you so much, Richard. Yes, and I'm curious. I'm going to go to Alexia first with a question, which is, I read, Alexia, that you that Netflix had this real sort of science-based approach and had some real superstars sort of helping to develop the net zero plus nature. And I'm just curious about that conversation that Netflix had with that panel. Sort of like, what were was there a general sort of consensus about the approach? Were there some tricky policy issues that you had to negotiate? How did you think about the not just the net zero, but the plus nature? Like, is that integrated into all of the different solutions, or do you emphasize that at different times? Just really curious how that conversation took place. It sounds like it was a really interesting one.
Yeah, thanks, Bettina. So that is really all credit to our CSO, Emma Stewart, who reached out to the broad network of scientists and thought leaders in this space who we collectively admire, both in the carbon markets and more broadly. I think we've seen a real change in the scientific discussion of these issues over the last just couple of years. So the IPCC report that came out this year, the synthesis report on 1.5 degrees, really underscored in a way that I had never, ever seen the scientific community come out and do, just how much trouble we're in globally in terms of temperature rise, how much uncertainty there is in a lot of those models and impact projections, and also just how urgently we need to act. So the IPCC, I think as many of you know, is the global panel of scientists, and they have come out and said unequivocally that we are, in a code red for humanity and for much of life on Earth, and we need to act with great urgency. And I think that, certainly for people who have been following and working on the science for many decades, that hit home for me personally really hard, and I think really underscored and reinvigorated our interest and commitment to making sure that science was at the heart of everything that we do, even when it's not easy. So our scientific advisors are there, and our senior advisory council is there. So Christiana Figueres, Johan Rockström, Catherine Hayhoe, a lot of the kind of leading lights in the science world who really are bridging the science and the stories. So a lot of the work that Netflix is doing outside of our net zero work, but more broadly on these issues, is really thinking proactively about how do we tell these stories? How do we tell great stories from everywhere, and how do we lift those stories up? So the scientific advisory committee really exists to provoke us, to keep us honest, to ensure that the policies and the programs and the work that we're doing internally is aligned with the best available science. And recognizing that changes. Our understanding of what's necessary, is evolving rapidly. And corporate strategies, and I would say all strategies in this space, need to also be able to evolve and adapt and be nimble. So we really sort of use the advisory panel to help us do that, and of course correct where necessary on a regular basis.
I love that Netflix, I love and envy that Netflix has this incredible ability to speak to the world through your programming, and that's part of your strategy. I will say that my friend the octopus was sort of a world phenomenon, and I am so happy that the octopus has always been my totem animal and has been completely forbidden as a food source. And I am so glad that movie appeared, and I finally have allies in not eating octopus at restaurants and so on. So thank you for that as well. That is also
Pipa Eldridge, the director of my octopus teacher, is also on our advisory committee. So we've seen that my octopus teacher has actually spurred now conservation activity in South Africa. of the kelp forests in ways that I think just might not have been possible had the movie not been made. So, we all know the power of stories to speak to people and help accelerate investment and engagement with these ecosystems across all sorts of different communities.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. For one person's personal journey with an octopus to that global impact is quite a lesson in how personalizing an issue can really create movement that statistics cannot, or that you need both to move forward. And with that, I'm curious on the same question about, I think you've described EFM as an entity that's concerned about, the full spectrum of goods and services from the forest. So we care about carbon, we care about biodiversity, we care about water, we care about communities, we care about tribes, we care about indigenous rights. Like, how does that influence how you select properties or how you develop a carbon project, with that broad framework?
Yeah, I mean, most of the dialogue and sort of the dominant, stories that we hear are that all of these values are generally not, that there are trade-offs to be made, right? That you cannot have financial value and value creation without trading off ecological value creation or biodiversity, so have you. And so I think for us, the story that we want to tell is that it is possible, and it is difficult. It is really hard. We're not at the scale of the Weyerhaeusers and the Rainiers of the world because it's hard. However, there's a happy coincidence, as you often say, Bettina, in that when you protect landscapes for carbon, you are also able to protect landscapes for biodiversity and for clean water. And that those values are very happily symbiotic. And so when we are thinking about forests and identifying forests, we're not going out there looking for the highest carbon sequestration potential forest, but we're looking for certain clues that would tell us that these forests are also valuable for other values. And so we're looking at their landscape connectivity, we're looking at their strategic position in the landscape, how they're connected to other public lands, what influence our forests might have and our management might have on a broader ecosystem, because ecosystem functioning doesn't happen, few trees at a time. It happens across landscape levels and at watersheds. And so, when we're thinking about acquisitions, we're thinking about where we put our precious dollars and how we monetize those dollars strategically and create financial value. It really is about thinking holistically and finding opportunities where we can create value through that whole slew of ecosystem services and not just sort of focus on any one particular thing. Nature tells us that diversification is the key to resilience. And so I think that is really the thing that we focus on as well in our investment strategies.
Perfect, thank you. And Richard, it sounds like the enhanced easement is actually an attempt to capture all of this within a single instrument, right? So I know that Amrita and all of us at EFM spent a lot of time trying to stack things like we'll add an easement plus a carbon project, plus some other type of mitigation or grant strategy for restoration. And you are actually hoping to combine it all in one beautiful bundle called an enhanced easement. And just curious if you want to expand on sort of what comes along with that enhanced easement besides the carbon piece and the forest protection.
Well, you actually described it beautifully, Bettina, and you also described Amrita, why I personally enjoy working with EFM so much on projects is because of your holistic view, which mirrors certainly how I think about our projects on the ground, and especially timber projects, but other projects too. The enhanced easement is an attempt to look at the issue of ecosystem services and to use carbon as almost, shall we say, just a benchmark in the broader bucket of benefits that go with a conservation play on land. My experience and the experience of the Trust for Public Land is very extensive around the easements and working with people, landowners cooperatively, but also, as you pointed out earlier, with funders. I do a lot of work with the U.S. Forest Service. I do a lot of work with, believe it or not, the U.S. Department of Defense through the REPI program, the Readiness Environmental Protection Integration Program. where when we have alignment of purpose around ecosystem services for us, which is primary, but for them, a lot of times this kinds of conservation has a lift for their missions, and as the military likes to put it, that kind of thing. But what we're trying to look at is the how do you incentivize people to change how they do things, especially around best management practices related to timber. And they have models, they have targets they're shooting for, and these are really important for businesses. Businesses have to be functioning, they have to be in the green and not in the red, in the black, if you will. The green, I like to use green. So what we're trying to do is think about it from a landowner standpoint and a business standpoint, and how do we incentivize folks to want to participate in a carbon project or a carbon way of thinking as a benchmark, and knowing that the ecosystem services are part of the package. But how the heck do we monetize this stuff so that we can get a better picture for it, and so that people incentivize it so people want to participate? And this is what we're doing. We're looking at the enhanced easement as a way not only to stipulate a change in business practices, but also to recognize the real cost to the landowner of foregoing their optimization models. I like to call it shifting the optimization model to a different kind of priority, which is, for us, it's this as simple as changing the cut rotation to a longer extension, and we know that it impacts things in a very positive way. And we're going to try to identify exactly what that means and what that looks like on the broader end. And fortunately, I'm happy to report that we have, it's not just me standing in the woods saying, hey, I've got a great idea. That's not what's going on here. It's our organization, but it's also our strategic partners. And looking at this and bringing the right people together, the right minds. Yes, we need the academic community. Yes, we need the scientific community. But guess what? We also need the business community, and we need the landowner community, and we need the local communities that are impacted by changes and how these businesses are done in rural areas, which is where most of these forests lie. So I am the first to step up and say EFM and Bettina and Amrita, that team is particularly aware and thoughtful about this, and is a huge partner for us as we look at the forests of Western Washington, Western Oregon, and also on the east side, which is a very different picture, where we're looking at, just quickly, average cut cycles of 60 to 80 years. Why? Because there's a lot less rain, a lot less moisture, and so trees just don't grow as fast. And it's also, that dryness is also what is part of the problem around forest fires right now. As the climate shifts and we see drier and drier weather patterns, if we don't do something to alter behavior on some of this stuff, we already, if anybody's watching TV and watching the photos, those are very real. And to be anywhere close to one of those fires is, it's just, it's a little shocking. It's Armageddon. It's no other way to describe it. It's stunning. So, but anyway, a couple of things I wanted to add to that. One is the current administration in the U.S. is very very aware of this issue, and is really working directly and even behind the scenes to try to find ways to bring more funding to the table for our group and for other groups that are involved in conservation. And it's meaningful. We're seeing some numbers now that are really meaningful. We're seeing the budgets around the Forest Service, around the REPI program at the DoD, these other ones, in some cases more than doubling. And in some cases, we're seeing one-time tranches going in that are pushing $1 billion in a given year. So it's a very exciting time to be doing what I'm doing, and working with teams like this one. What I'd really like to see is part of what we're talking about here is the private sector stepping in and finding a role for them to really enhance what we're doing, because that's where the big changes are going to occur. And you heard me say it earlier, I'm a real believer in markets, and I believe that if you want to change behavior and you want to do it quickly, you incentivize it. You find a way to give people a great big carrot and say, here you go, you want to play or not? And what we find on the ground, on the front lines, which is where I operate, is you don't have to work very hard to convince people when the stars align, when it makes sense to them, you're using logic and you're looking after their interests as well as your own.
Mhm.
No, that makes perfect sense, Richard. I think that's absolutely right, is that what we need to do is we need to change structures and incentives and opportunities so that choosing the climate smart path is the natural choice when you're trying to, promote your own self-interest or corporate self-interest. So I completely agree with that and really look forward to the analysis and work that you do. Speaking of public funding at a massive scale, of course, in the last few weeks, COP has been happening. All of us, I think, that are not there, or even those that were there, are there, are trying to figure out exactly what has happened and what has shifted. And Alexia, I know you spent 5 years at the State Department and you were very close to all of this. And I'm just curious, watching now from a little bit more of a distance than you were then, how does, it might be early days for you to make some sort of final incisive comments about this, but I'm just curious sort of how, for your position at Netflix now, and given the program, how what happens at COP or doesn't happen at COP influences, your actions over the next few years.
Yeah, thanks, Bettina. So obviously regulation in this space is incredibly important just as a general matter. So strong climate policy is going to be one of the most important elements of addressing the climate crisis. We're not going to get there on the backs of voluntary corporate commitments alone. So it is wonderful that there are, leading companies who are willing to put their money where their mouth is. And I think increasingly, particularly for large companies that are headquartered in the United States and Europe, there's an increasing recognition of the importance and centrality of an ambitious climate program as just part of your cost of doing business. So that is really wonderful to see. And I think a market change from where we were. In terms of what came out of Glasgow, we obviously finished and sort of were able to include Article 6 in 2016. They have been essentially working through the implementation rule book and for those of you who aren't familiar with Article 6, it's the article of the Paris Agreement that governs international emissions trading between and among countries as a way to make progress towards their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which are each country's independent climate commitments and emission reduction targets. But to enable that international emissions trading system. So obviously the Kyoto Protocol had a system that was very large and very robust, and also in many ways challenged. And the conversation has really been about what happens to the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms, what are the rules for ensuring that we aren't double counting emissions among countries when they're trading. So how does that all work? How do you implement what are called corresponding adjustments, which is if I'm a country and I'm selling to another country, you actually need to adjust your greenhouse gas inventory and ensure that you're reporting to the UN that you've sold that credit. The interaction with the voluntary market is interesting because the voluntary market really sits in many ways adjacent to all of that. So we in the voluntary space do not need Article 6 infrastructure. The voluntary market has built an entire infrastructure largely with the support of independent third-party nonprofit organizations that essentially set the rules and manage the market. And so that infrastructure all exists. I think the next 5 years are really going to be about how does that infrastructure interact with one another, particularly when it comes to additionality tests. So I think in North America and for North American headquartered companies, it's a little easier because our emissions are all neatly nested, right? So like Netflix's emissions get counted in the national inventory of the United States. So anything that we're investing in here in the United States can both go to meet our commitment and also help make progress towards the United States' NDC should they choose to count the emission reductions from that sector. So I think there's going to be a lot of new rules that are put in place, but net, overall, I was very encouraged to see the strong recognition, and not just recognition, but encouragement of voluntary market activities. I think there's an increasing recognition by governments of the importance of private sector leadership And so those pieces, I think, will continue to come together. But I think all things being equal, it's really full steam ahead with respect to voluntary carbon market growth and action broadly. And I'm encouraged to see that we're now finally going to have the conversation around, okay, how do all these systems like work together, and how do we really help ensure that these markets are delivering the environmental and climate change impacts that we so desperately need them to.
That's a really helpful analysis. And Amrita, I know that EFM is also investing on behalf of clients in carbon projects in places like Colombia and Peru and Ecuador. And I know that this question about nesting and how these voluntary projects fit into national schemes and international accords is a subject of very high interest. And just curious about your comments and perspective on that, and how that is how you can do voluntary carbon project development in countries where perhaps the national accounting system is less developed.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you're right, Bettina. EFM has recently expanded our footprint to include advising families and corporates and other institutional investors on net zero portfolios. And in fact, going beyond net zero, how can you create a robust portfolio of investments in land use strategies and real asset strategies that actually remove carbon from the atmosphere and create net negative emissions. And so that, as we all know, nature has the potential to provide up to 30% of the mitigation solutions needed. And so this type of investing is going to become even more critical. And seeing the opportunities that the voluntary market has created in the US, we think that, that type of activity, investment activity, financial activity, innovation, partnership, is going to be critical to investments in other developed and developing countries. And I think that the infrastructure, as Alexia mentioned, the infrastructure rules that the voluntary market has already created and is rapidly evolving has really created enough infrastructure for financial investors to start taking steps today. We're certainly markets are evolving, rules are changing, and as investors looking to make investments, you always hesitate when there are, when the ground is shifting underneath you. But I think the fundamentals around the markets have not changed. In fact, they're getting a lot better. Many countries, Colombia, for example, have already put in, national policy and infrastructure to support climate action that plays quite nicely with voluntary markets. So, we are seeing really great opportunities in emerging markets, particularly in Latin America, in Colombia, Brazil at the jurisdictional level. There is not, in some cases, it makes sense to wait, where countries, really are taking the important necessary steps to ready themselves to attract private capital. You don't want to be too far ahead of the game, but there are many countries where it's already they've already taken the hard steps. They've set national policies. They've created jurisdictional programs. They're aware of nesting and the need for policies that address nesting. And so in those countries, I think we find it very possible to make sound, attractive investments in natural climate solutions.
So just incorporating a question from the audience that I think has been very topical lately. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in the press and elsewhere about greenwashing, or about, a natural climate solution, some natural solution projects that are not robust enough. And at the same time, I think that, for those of us familiar with VERA and ACR and ARB and some of the other standards that have gone through years of addressing rigor in standards around additionality and leakage and so on. What do you, I guess the question is sort of, how do we reconcile that? Why is there this discussion about greenwashing and projects that are not robust, where at the same time you have these voluntary standards that have gone through that process? Do you think it is a lack of information or understanding around the voluntary carbon development and verification process? Do you think that there are some legitimate issues? Do you think, Alexia, as you mentioned, that there are some carbon cowboys out there that are not always, that are bending the rules and sort of distorting the reputation for the rest of us that are trying to really introduce rigor. Just curious about how each of you feel about sort of what is causing that conversation and how we might address it so that there is greater confidence in the market. Whoever wants to start.
I'll say a general comment if you don't mind, Bettina, and that is that transparency and how things work and keeping things as simple as possible are just some basic concepts that I think help build confidence and help people learn to trust processes and things. I know that just because of what I do and the fact that I'm interacting with people on the front lines that way all the time. So if I have, for my part on this conversation, if I have anything to offer on that, it is related to those kinds of human aspects of this, and that is whatever we do, it needs to be transparent, it needs to be easy to understand, it needs to be clear, and it needs to be easy to implement on the ground, and it makes a huge difference how people perceive it from there.
That makes a lot of sense. Alexia, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of worry and, frankly, some legitimate worry about greenwashing. I think the thing that has changed is that we now have credible third-party systems for driving internal decarbonization strategies. And I think often the concern is that people are either offsetting, which is that they're investing and buying, cheap offsets to continue to emit, or they're looking at, really the opportunity to invest in high quality offsets as additional contribution to the climate fight. So for us, making progress on our internal decarbonization goal and then taking that extra step to fully cover emissions that frankly are much, much harder for us to abate because they're in our supply chain. We don't even necessarily know where all of them are. That is an action that we can take today. So I think that on that basis, the conversation has moved a lot in the last few years. And, I think leading with that, yes, we are reducing our emissions and are on track globally, because if everybody just offsets, we're not actually going to reduce emissions at a global level at the scale that we need to. I will say that I think, there's challenges with all of the methodologies and standards that are out there. It turns out that developing, 100% accurate and precise systems for measuring an invisible odorless gas that we can't actually measure or hold on to is hard. And, there's going to be false positives in the system always. So I think, Bettina, to your point, the system has been working, the standard setting bodies have been working really hard to evolve and will continue to evolve. And I think as long as we're generally confident that, the system is doing significantly more good than anything else, then we can continue to invest in it with confidence, recognizing that it's not going to be 100% perfect. And there's just no getting around that, because no GHG accounting system in the world is 100% perfect and accurate.
Yeah, I really, to jump in here, I really couldn't agree with you more, Alexia. And, this is such an evolving market, and it should be, right? So just 10 years ago, renewable energy was not additional. Today, it's a lower cost, technology than fossil fuels. And so standards for what is additional in the renewable energy market is changing. And I think that sort of if evolution will continue to occur and should occur even in our space. But it's a complicated story. The market is complicated. The rules are complicated. And so there's a huge level of information asymmetry between, the project developers and the market insiders and the general public and the general media. There's also a large level of information asymmetry with investors and financial investors that are coming into this space without understanding, the market infrastructure and the rules around, very technical rules around methodologies and baseline development and how you measure carbon. So I think all of that is just creating a lot of noise. And there's also a lot of, money trying to be deployed in this space, looking for solutions, to be honest. when sometimes the best solution is to just invest in a project and learn as you go. So, I think that this is just a period of noise, and hopefully as the dust settles from COP and as standards unionize and harmonize between compliance and voluntary markets, and general, policy and civil society sort of rules and norms become more best practice, as we sort of evolve together. I think it will sort of settle a little bit, but I think we're in a bit of a complicated space for now.
Yeah, I really like all of those comments. And I think that, when a new market develops, there will be noise. There will be noise, there will be cowboys. And I think this market has actually generally done pretty well. And I would just, beg the purists in the world that, we need all of the solutions. And we need, I think, as you pointed out, Amrita, a form of adaptive management, which is you learn as you go. You put the best system in place. You realize that the system can be abused or isn't accurate in some way. You adapt it, and you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, but you keep evolving towards higher and higher rigor and quality, because we cannot afford to not have any of the solutions on the table. They all have to be on the table all the time. And I think we need to be patient and kind with each other and assume the best for most, as we evolve these projects and the nesting strategies, the national accords, the international accords, the voluntary standards. So I hope that we can all have that sort of patience and kindness. Alexia, I am curious about, I know you've been at Netflix for only, I think, maybe 4 or 5 months, but knowing you already know everything. And so I'm just curious about, the portfolio that, as Netflix has gone out with this program, the portfolio that it has assembled, of natural climate solutions, and sort of like what you find the most, well, first of all, if you could just describe the portfolio in whatever terms you'd like, and then also sort of like what you personally find the most exciting and compelling in terms of a project type or an ecosystem type that you think holds either great promise or great excitement for your program.
Oof, yeah, thanks, Bettina. I'll try and be quick because it's a lot to cover. Overall, I have to confess, so this is the first time I've ever actually worked in an in-house sustainability role for a corporation, and it's been really fun and challenging to get out in the market and actually start transacting. I've always worked on this from the other side of the table, which is either as a policymaker or as a standard setter. And the due diligence that we've done for our sort of first couple of portfolios has really, I would say, reinvigorated my faith in markets to drive real world outcomes. One of my favorite stories is a project in PNG who had been acquired by some former military guys that were working for the Chinese government. And they had the timber cruise company come out to do their first timber cruise because they were going to cut down the rainforest. And the timber cruise company said, well, what about, have you heard of this thing called a carbon market? And they said, no, we haven't. And they looked into it. And, 3 years later, here they are, selling the tons, leaving the trees and selling the tons into the carbon markets. And so the ability of these markets to just get money directly into the hands of communities is, I think, really, really remarkable. We are also seeing, though, I think to your point, Bettina, we're starting to see, because of the churn and the froth, a lot of speculative activity coming in again, a lot of new people saying, the standard setting bodies, they're too hard. So we're just going to figure out our own standards that work better and really move away from the high quality and rigor that we know is required to govern this market in a way that drives the outcomes we need. So it is a buyer beware market. We do an enormous amount of diligence on everything that's in our portfolio. It is a very diverse portfolio. So everything from grasslands restoration and removal projects to traditional reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation projects, to some work in North America as well. So all sorts of kind of nature-based projects I think we're particularly excited by and have been working actively in putting together an alliance of corporate offset buyers for a Blue Carbon Buyers Alliance. So really excited about the opportunity to dig in on blue carbon ecosystems, mangroves, peatlands, wetlands. There is an enormous amount of degradation that's happened across those ecosystems globally. And we're really starting to see carbon markets kind of figure their way out to driving investment and outcomes into those communities as well. So I worked in international development for a very long time. And I will tell you that a lot of these offset projects are driving the best international development outcomes from a resilience, from a job creation, and from a direct community benefit impact perspective that I've ever seen. So overall, I believe even more strongly in these markets' ability, when properly structured and regulated, to really drive the change on the ground that we know is so desperately needed across all of our global landscapes.
I love that, Alexia, and I love that that the time that you have spent in this role at Netflix has affirmed your faith in markets, and I know you are a blue carbon aficionada, as is my friend Amrita. And we have just a few more minutes before we close the session. There's a question about how investors can capitalize on biodiversity. And Alexia, I think you just gave some great examples in terms of blue carbon projects, which are which may be designed as carbon projects, but are absolutely brimming with biodiversity. And we should mention that many of the carbon project development, like Vera and others that are standard setting, also have a standard for biodiversity. And so there's a way to measure that as well in projects. So Amrita and Richard, I think in closing, just let's talk about biodiversity for a moment, because as I told you, that's my that's my deep passion linked with carbon. And how, Amrita, if you could just perhaps reference, like, how does biodiversity play a role in any of the carbon projects you've developed? I know you referenced mule deer when you were talking about Fort Rock, but I'm just curious, more broadly, how do you, I know you have a love for biodiversity as well, how do you bring that into your carbon project work? And then I'm going to turn to Richard with the same question to close us out.
Great. I remember to go off mute, Bettina. So absolutely, I think that, biodiversity drives both the very practical ways in which we design projects, but it also influences the storytelling around how we sell these projects and what makes them appealing to buyers. So there's both aspects. I think that from a practical project developer perspective, biodiversity helps us design better projects. So if we know, for example, that we have threatened salmon species along very important waterways in these forests, then we design our buffers and our forest management to support those species. So our expanded buffers, which are go beyond regulation, essentially create a no harvest or very limited harvest zone around streams that supports water retention. It supports the flow of nitrogen back into the streams. It supports water quality, water temperature, and that in turn affects the biodiversity outcomes that we all want. And so those sort of going beyond the rules is sort of one of the basic tests of whether you're doing something that's additional or not in a carbon project. So, I think that's one way in which a carbon project in a forest can be designed to support biodiversity. Similarly, creating reserves and special no-touch reserves in areas where we know that there are sensitive species can also go towards supporting biodiversity outcomes. And there's a whole lot more, but I think I'll stop with those two examples there and see what Richard might want to add.
I think what I would add is I would take us actually back one step. I absolutely agree with you, Amrita and Alexia, on all of this stuff, but I would say what I see happening on the ground at a rate that's just really, really hard to see is conversion, where we have healthy systems in place that are operating right now and that are functioning as habitat. And one example I would give is forest fragmentation, where we see, and remember folks, I'm up in Seattle, one of the fastest growing regions in the world, really. Huge amounts of population moving into the area and places that have been standing working forests for 150 years are now getting cut up and getting converted into, as I mentioned earlier, concrete and asphalt, which is kind of the number one thing on my radar right now. Is if we can't slow down conversion immediately and really pull it back, then we can do all the restoration we want in the world, and that kind of thing will never catch up. We have to slow that aspect down on the front end, maintain the healthy systems that we have in place right now, and then build from there. So I see it as kind of a three-step process here. The first is protect and maintain what we've got, and then start building back and expanding on what we have for habitat and biodiversity. I've lived in Seattle for going on 40 years now, and the changes that I've witnessed in my time are just amazing. But I'm not trying to be judgy here. They're just amazing, and not something I would have expected to see 30, 40 years ago. But the habitat is impacted, and it is being impacted, and the forests are burning in part because of the in-hole dates and some of the different things. So biodiversity is essential. I see carbon as a benchmark by which we can work, and we can capture biodiversity along with a lot of the other ecosystem services. But I would say the most pressing issue right now is conversion. And for my own organization, for TPL in general, we have a real focus on rural community and communities in general, and how do we retain resiliency and sustainability for these rural communities and keep them healthy while we make the changes that we need to do to protect these lands.
That's a great closing, Richard. And I think it takes us back to the beginning that carbon is a portal to biodiversity. We haven't talked about the water crisis, but it is a portal to protecting water resources. It is a portal to protecting indigenous tribes, their land sovereignty and their cultural diversity. It is a portal to rural diversity and a portal to the transition to a bioeconomy. So with all that, thank you. I mean, talking with all of you gives me such renewed faith that we are going to do this. And I really appreciate your contributions. And with that, we will close. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.